Well, it's 9:30, so welcome everyone. It's very good to see so many participants. I think we've got about 110. So it's extremely good to see you all. And I hope you'll find this helpful and interesting. My name is Barry Joyce. I'm a trustee of the Derbyshire Historic Buildings Trust, which is hosting this morning's session. With the help of its outstanding executive officer, Lucy Godfrey, who's going to do her best to do all the techie stuff. We have 10 speakers, and I intend to do my very best to keep a tight rein on the programme, with a view to ending it roughly around midday, but with the option of staying on for the final open forum, going on as long as those who have burning questions or a desire to express opinions wish. We will have 2 comfort breaks at 10:50 and at 11:45. Timing's always difficult to estimate, but I'm going to try and keep to those comfort break times. Will everyone please remain muted unless speaking? Now, I'd allocated 5 minutes for that, and you see it's only taken about 2, really. So we're already ahead of the game. The purpose of this event is to offer lessons from our experience here in Derbyshire in the service of what I think is the most recent compulsory purchase notice for a listed building to arrest further decay. The Derbyshire Historic Buildings Trust first placed Wingfield Station on its buildings at risk register 35 years ago. And I know that because I was party to it happening. The building in question is the only surviving railway station on the Derby to Leeds North Midland Railway line, which was created by George and his son Robert Stephenson in 1840. But more of that will be explained by others and its great significance. But suffice it to say, the Victorian Society identified it as one of the most important Victorian buildings at risk and called it our maimed beauty, which is a rather appropriate comment, and helped us in our presentation to others of its significance. Our first speaker is Ben Robinson of Historic England, but perhaps better known to you as the flying archaeologist on television programmes. He will outline the national situation regarding buildings at risk, together with Bob Kindred of the Institute of Historic Building Conservation and long-time editor of Context. So 5 minutes early for you, Ben. So can we go over to you for your presentation of the national situation, the national recognition of need, please?
Thanks very much, Barry, and thanks for getting the slides up, Lucy. I've just got 1 or 2 slides to show. I'm not going to bombard you with images. There'll be some lovely images of the actual place that's the subject of the case study later on. And similarly, my colleague Amanda White later on will talk about the mechanics of how Historic England got involved and what we were able to do in terms of grants. But by way of introduction, I'm a partnerships team leader in the Midlands for Historic England. And that's a sort of new term for something which still has heritage at risk at its heart. I was heritage at risk team leader before that. And since I joined Historic England, 12 years ago now, heritage at risk has been at the forefront of my work. Of course, we only see it from one angle, that of an advice, a place where you can get advice, technical advice, and occasionally grants. And so one of the interesting things for me today will be to hear about the other angles, the perspectives from the grant recipients and those trying to undertake these works from all sorts of different angles. But anyway, here's a sort of historic England view of the situation that we have out there in terms of buildings at risk. It's worth just recapping that the first register, that for London, was published by English Heritage then in 1991, the first attempt to get a comprehensive idea of the buildings at risk in London. We know that there were earlier surveys. We know that others were doing something similar. Barry's already alluded to the work that the Derbyshire Trust were doing in their patch, and there were similar surveys being undertaken elsewhere. But for English Heritage, the momentum on heritage at risk, understanding buildings at risk, really began with that first campaign in London in 1991. In 1998, that was widened out to across the country, and for the first time gave a snapshot of the extent of trouble that was facing highly graded listed buildings. And it was exclusively highly graded listed buildings, except in London. So 1- and 2-star buildings. In 2008, that intelligence, that evidence gathering was extended to places of worship, to scheduled monuments more emphatically. So it became a heritage at risk register. And if we could go back one slide, actually, Lucy, just the format of the registers will be familiar to you now. Each region publishes its register. There are lists of the assets that have been identified as at risk. We will bug conservation officers every year to update those lists, to suggest new candidates. And we will use our teams, our project officers, our architect surveyors to assess the level of risk and to establish whether we need to get things on the register or not. Now, suffice to say, the register contains many, many interesting cases. There are a huge number of fantastically interesting stories behind every asset on that register. Some of it is misfortune, some of it is neglect, some of it is cynical neglect. And it's not the case that statutory intervention is applicable to everything on the register. Of course not. There are categories of monument where it's simply not applicable and appropriate, places of worship, etc. But there is a percentage of cases where that becomes necessary or desirable, at least. Midway down the page there, you can see the subject of our case study today, Wingfield Station. It entered the National Heritage at Risk Register in 2015. Next slide, please, Lucy. So just trying to get an impression of the magnitude of the issues and the need out there. Currently, around 3.4% of the grade 1 and 2-star buildings in England, the secular ones, are on the register, 3.4%. In the Midlands, it's 5.2%. And that maybe starts to give an impression of different areas of need where risk occurs more frequently than in other places. We're acutely aware that our own register doesn't seek to assess grade 2 buildings, and except in London. So does London give us a clue of the extent of need across the country? Well, not really, I would suggest. London is London, very different economic circumstances in most of London. And so there we can see that where they have assessed grade 2 buildings, 2.2% are at risk. In our own region here in the Midlands, we have a handful of registers maintained by local authorities and others. I think nationally, last time it was surveyed, about a third of local authorities had some kind of idea of what was at risk in their areas, maintained some kind of register that included grade 2s. So in Bassetlaw, looking at their own register and ours, which they keep up to date, 6.6% of buildings at risk. And then moving down to areas, 4.9% of conservation areas are deemed to be at risk. Now, that the information is only good as the information we receive. So, you know, I wouldn't necessarily say it's anything other than a general guide. Next slide, please, Lucy. Now, of those buildings, 6.6, let's say, in somewhere like Bassett Law, around 5% in the Midlands, not all are going to be eligible for various grant schemes that we run. But we are trying to get more involved in place shaping and more involved in reaching those parts that we haven't reached before. And an expression of that has been the Heritage Action Zones and the High Street Heritage Action Zones. We know initiatives are coming through from government to look at helping places, levelling up, all that kind of thing, the towns funds, all that kind of thing. Money can come to places. And where we have willing recipients, as here, the image of Wardwick in Derby, below was before the Seeker scheme, the top is after, where that street has been considerably smartened up. Where we have willing recipients, we can offer grants where the market is able to sustain enhancements. We find very often people do that off their own bat. But of course, we also face situations, next slide, please, where however much an owner might be incentivized or encouraged to participate in partnerships, be encouraged in a planning sense, that those owners are simply not willing to play ball or not able to play ball. They don't want to sell. They don't want to form any kind of partnerships. They don't want to look creatively at the problem. They would rather hope that something bad happens to their building and they're left with a cleared site. And so however hard we try to place shape, to enhance places, if we've got that elephant in the room of a building that is simply not working for its community, is not working for its place, is dragging it down, then we have failed to do what we want to do. We have failed to shape a place, to enhance a place. And these are the really difficult ones. And this is why, next slide, this, by the way, is the Hippodrome in Derby. So it's just across the city centre from the Wardwick area and the Strand there that benefited from all that good work from the City Council and ourselves. So this is why there are various mechanisms to ensure that local authorities can take action where owners are simply not willing to do so voluntarily. And in the latter two cases, and are very keen to do so, because we see this as a key plank of fulfilling that objective to make places function, to level places up, and to provide a built environment that communities really, really deserve. The survey evidence, as I've said, is patchy. We don't have a complete picture of all of those buildings for which some form of statutory action would be appropriate. But in a way, we don't need that. We need an idea of the level of risk. You will know in your patches, if you've lived anywhere for any length of time or worked anywhere for any length of time, you will know those buildings that for years, no solution seems to have appeared. And where, therefore, stepping in directly and sorting it out would be appropriate. You could all write on the back of a page of A4 a number of buildings in your area where that's the case. And where you have those, I would encourage dialogue with ourselves to see if there's anything we can do to move things forward. And there I will leave it, Barry, not wishing to incur your wrath for running too far over time. And also to invite Bob to...
Yeah, I'll leave you to invite Bob. Come on, Bob.
Yes. Well, he needs no introduction. He's been in the game a very long time, has written the guidance, and may have some observations to make on the national picture.
Right, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Those who don't know me, I've been probably dealing with buildings at risk effectively for about nearly 40 years. And in fact, when I was at Ipswich Borough Council, we ran the pilot programme for buildings at risk in conjunction with the late Vanessa Brand of English Heritage back in 1984. And I was going to produce a number of bullet points effectively at the end of this morning during the open session. But what I would like to just emphasise the point that Ben's made about a third of local authorities appearing to have a register of some kind. Now, some of those, of course, are individual local authority registers. Some are collective ones on a county-wide basis. But one of the things that disturbs me really is that the simple fact that obviously 2/3 of local authorities don't seem to know what buildings might potentially be at risk. Very few of them have ever photographed their buildings. In some cases, when I dealt with a couple of local authorities in London, we were rather shocked to discover that in fact buildings were no longer still standing, let alone in poor condition. And many of these registers are not reviewed regularly. When I look at several of the registers in East Anglia, two things become evident. One is the date on which the entry was made, and some of those can be 10 or 15 years ago, and the fact that the local authorities are now under so much pressure for short-term intensive workload, particularly development management advice, that they don't have time to devote to the resources necessary to actually review buildings at risk, because it's resource intensive, and we know the pressures that local authorities are under. So inevitably, buildings at risk slips down the pecking order, if you like, or the priorities of the authority. And I'd be very interested this morning to hear what's going to be said about political support, because the last thing I'd just say at this point, well, now and the time, is that I attend seminars on these and a number of other heritage management subjects, and sadly, one of the aspects that's never raised is the involvement of councillors and political support or otherwise. And it does seem to me crucial that unless the local authority officers have their councillors fully engaged with the subject, it probably won't be resourced properly. And I think on that particular note, I'll perhaps stop to keep to time, and I'll raise some of these other points at the start of the open forum.
Thank you very much, Bob. As Bob said, he will be leading the open forum, and that will be not exactly time unlimited, but will give us as much time as I think we need to debate matters further. We're now going to have a look at the thing that has prompted this presentation, which is the building at risk in Wingfield, South Wingfield in Derbyshire. And I'm very happy to introduce my former colleague, Alan Morrison. He and I worked together for many years in the Derbyshire County Council Conservation team. And Alan has been struggling with this problem at Wingfield for longer than anyone else. And I can't resist just saying that when we handed over the building, or when we were handed the building in a back-to-back agreement by Amber Valley Borough Council, the former owner was actually there and pointed to Alan and I and said, "They are the enemy." Well, it's unpleasant to be thought of as the enemy of a listed building, but I'm afraid at the Derbyshire Historic Building Trust, we have a saying, which is shared by others I know, which is that there is no such thing as a problem building, only a problem owner. Anyway, may I hand over now to my former colleague, Alan Morrison, the one-time historic buildings architect at Derbyshire County Council.
Thank you, Barry, and welcome to everyone. I hope you can all hear me adequately. Wingfield Station is a fantastic success story, but with a very long history of delays and inaction spanning nearly 40 years from the time I joined the County Council in 1980 until the present time. To compress its planning history into 10 minutes is asking a lot, but here goes. Barry said, a problem owner, not a problem building. In 1979, an individual I shall refer to as Mr. G bought the redundant and empty station buildings and surrounding land from British Rail's Property Board. He claimed to have had a career in transportation and was enthusiastic about transport and industrial heritage. And so began years of him collecting and storing transport memorabilia, including old cars, vans, and even railway wagons in the buildings and the yard. Now, in the early 1980s, County Council officers, including myself and Barry, approached him about the decay of the building, mainly the roof. He had little money, but claimed to have a house to sell, which would release funds to finance repairs and allow him to live in it, subject to planning permission. He sought grant aid from the County Council and was offered a small grant towards roof repairs, but apparently not enough, so no progress was made. In February '83, there had still not been any progress on site, so County Council officers advised Amber Valley Borough Council that a full repairs notice and CPO action were appropriate. Council officers bounced the ball back to the County Council, saying it should continue negotiations with Mr. G and take the appropriate action. In early '84, the County Council prepared to serve an urgent works notice, obtained builders' estimates for carrying out the works, and prepared documentation for a full repairs notice and CPO action. The urgent works were carried out by the County Council's contractor, with the costs charged to Mr. G. He appealed to the Secretary of State, lost his appeal, and had to reimburse the County Council. At this time, the Borough Council considered action under the Acquisition of Land Act, but decided that as the trust was in existence, if it could take on the project and be available as valuable backup, then acquisition by the Borough Council should not be necessary, and they resolved to take no further action. Regrettably, and despite strong support from the trust, in 1985, the County Council CPO action was halted for various reasons, including financial cutbacks, but the least of which was the perceived need to divert the public footpath from going through the site, as it still does. In 1986, Mr. G was granted planning permission for a change of use to a residence, and again much later, in 1997, the permission was renewed, but both consents were so heavily conditioned that Mr. G felt unable to comply and simply kept up his frequent complaints to the council, complaints that the council was making life difficult for him. The Borough Council pushed him to begin repairs so as to avoid another urgent works notice, but to no avail. Then in September 1990, the Borough Council resolved three things, inter alia, including the station in a conservation area, making it eligible in theory for grant aid from English Heritage at that time, and to bring this to Mr. G's attention. Second thing was to request the County Council to recommence repairs notice and compulsory purchase action. And thirdly, in the absence of any positive action by Mr. G, to commence repairs notice and CPO action itself with the backing of the DHBT. For financial reasons, the County Council decided to take no further action. For nearly 10 years, it seems very little happened. By May 2000, the Borough Council had served a full repairs notice, but had taken no further action while looking for a buyer. The Trust had repeated its interest, but only for acquisition at a much lower price than considered appropriate by the Borough Council's Estates Officer. At this time, the Council considered the service of a Section 215 notice in respect of the cars and vans Mr. G had been dumping or collecting in the station yard, but did not proceed with the action. In 2013, the Borough Council again resolved to go for CPO action and started the process by engaging a private architect to draw up the necessary schedule of works for the full repairs notice, but still without having a clearly defined exit strategy drawn up. But in 2015, the game changer happened. Thanks to the efforts of the South Wingfield Local History Group, the true significance of Wingfield Station was recognised by Historic England, with its list grading raised to 2-star, putting it firmly on the pedestal it deserved. Immediately, there was the prospect of support and financial assistance from Historic England, and the exit strategy for the Borough Council could be envisaged. Firmly now in partnership with the Council, the Borough Council, the Trust now formally offered to acquire the station from the Council, subject to a feasibility study for which the Architectural Heritage Fund gave a project viability grant. Pushed again by the Council to make progress on site, Mr. G claimed to have sold a house in London which would give him funds to pursue his still undefined plans for repairing the buildings, and was not prepared to negotiate with the Borough Council to give up his property voluntarily. Meantime, he had been served with a Section 215 notice on the mechanical mess in the yard. He failed to comply. The Borough Council charged him with the cost of doing it themselves and recovered the £14,000 on appeal, money that could have been spent on the building. In September 2015, Amber Valley Borough Council's Cabinet resolved to authorise the officers to use all powers available to the Council to ensure the protection and repair of the building, including recommending to full Council a budget of £200,000 for the purpose, which was duly approved. The salvation of Wingfield Station now looked more certain than it had done for decades. So why had it taken so long for effective legal action to be implemented? Clearly, the list upgrading and the availability of Historic England and lottery funding made a huge difference to the prospects of success once an exit strategy for the Council could be foreseen. But with hindsight, it's clear that procrastination and buck passing between the local authorities involved was partly to blame. But perhaps more significantly, despite repeated threats of legal action against the owner, a lack of commitment to follow through on the action, an underlying lack of confidence in managing the consequences, and the inability to compile the necessary exit strategy were the main causes of delay. Throughout this saga, Mr. G did nothing himself to arrest the decay of the buildings. Every approach by officers of the local authorities was met with mild hostility and usually led to him writing long, rambling letters to council officers and members and the press, complaining of harassment, trespass, too onerous and questionable planning conditions, and a lack of any financial help. And as Barry said in front of witnesses, Mr. G called us the enemy. Worse still, it's on record that he threatened to destroy the station if the Trust got its hands on it. Thank goodness he didn't. What a problem owner. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well, Alan, you've done the impossible. You've done it in 10 minutes. Thank you very much. And what a talk to your story it is. And in the open forum, I think we'll be able to debate the pros and cons of how it could have gone better. You've already mentioned the critical role of the local community, and in particular the local History Society at South Wingfield. So I'm now very pleased to introduce to you Carol Brown, a member of that community, and she will just explain briefly how the community has played this very important role in the rescue of this building that was close to their hearts. Over to you, Carol.
Good morning. I am the chair of the South Wingfield Local History Group. You see in front of you a picture of us in all our glory. We're a small group We meet, as many local history groups do, on a monthly basis throughout the year. We have a programme of visiting speakers. We visit local sites and we undertake projects. And you're seeing us there in 2019 at the successful conclusion of a project which was to erect a war memorial in the village, and it's on the marketplace. Now, a little of the station in terms of the heritage and what it means to the village. Obviously, a station was part of the community for 183 years. It was a vibrant station for 122 years. It shaped the growth of industry, the mines, the commerce and building. It provided connection to Belper, to Derby and Chesterfield for places of work. And most importantly, possibly, and what's in people's memory, is the recreational use. The fact that people could go on day visits and day trips to the seaside on holidays. All that was brought to an abrupt end with the closure of the station in the 1960s. And the outcome in terms of transport links, as we were provided with a more regular bus service. And I'm sure we can all appreciate those words that we often use now and how we feel about when they talk about a replacement bus service coming into fruition. And that's what we had. So we had a redundant station building towards the end of the 1960s. Early 70s, it was used as a short-term let, and it was used to store equipment. 1971, has already been mentioned, the building was listed, grade 2. And latterly, as the 70s wore on, the building was empty. It wasn't particularly used for anything, and local residents were concerned as to what was going to happen. And they were writing letters, as residents do, to Amber Valley Borough Council, the County Council, British Rail, the local MPs. And the question really was what was going to happen to the building. In the forefront of everybody's mind was it be demolished? And obviously it wouldn't have been because it was listed. Another suggestion at the time, and the speculation, was would it be moved piecemeal to the Midland Railway at Butterley, where there was a museum, and be re-erected there? Or would it become a restaurant? And as I'm sure you can imagine, the local newspaper carried many articles about the possible outcome for the building. In 1977, it was surplus to British Rail's requirements and it was sold. And you may be interested to know that the advert for the station was headed "Just the ticket, an opportunity to buy a Victorian station complete with running trains." Not sure how that was grasped by people, but obviously we've been foretold of Mr. G becoming the private buyer. And then for many years, as has been illustrated, it was in a poor state of repair. It became dilapidated, and increasingly the community were concerned, particularly the parish council, and particularly some local residents who were beginning to understand the rarity of the building, and railway enthusiasts who used to come up to the station and could remember it in its heyday and said, oh, this should be saved. The galvanising response for the history group was in 2012, the local resident on the main road in South Wingfield had a letter from Amber Valley, and it was suggesting they were going to take out enforcement action with respect to the property edged in red on the plan. Yippee was the history group, and I think probably the local community's response, because that was the station. They were seeking to find the identity of the station owner. And I believe, as has already been said in a sense, the ongoing action, I think the community probably were a little unaware of some of it. But for the history group, that galvanised them into a project to save the station. And people were called on site. Our borough councillor, there was a site visit, and as already been mentioned, it went to planning at Amber Valley Council. And as a history group, what do we do best? We research. So we began to research the architecture and the high quality of the architecture of the building, the rarity of the building as it was the only one remaining on the line, and the unmitigated disaster that was in front of people, that would it fall into a ruinous state. Partly that was because it was actually unaltered. So it was actually still in the state of being built in 1840. despite the trees growing out the roof and the vegetation encroaching on the building. So the history group took action from that point, really, and I think chivied where we could Amber Valley Borough Council, who were obviously going through due process in terms of planning legislation and legal requirements. So we were having dialogues with Amber Valley about what they were doing. And then we began to look at the relisting, and that was really the case that we were able to make, drawing in the Victorian Society's recommendations, a very important report from the Alan Baxter Associates about the electrification of the Midland Main Line, the railway community that were beginning to lobby and become interested, and it was attracting attention in their specialist publications. And obviously it goes without saying the important role of English heritage in all this. We were invited in 2015 to comment on the consultation report that Historic England had put forward, which we did. And you'll be delighted on the screen now to see that the letter came to our treasurer at the time, Mr. Smith, informing us that the station had indeed been relisted as Grade 2 star. And if I had to give a caption for this talk, it would be, what difference does a star make? Which we all know. I'd briefly just like to say that we worked with the Derbyshire Historic Buildings Trust. Barry's already mentioned the plight of Derbyshire buildings. He came to talk to us in 2017, and we took on board the fact that not only did we need to save the station, but there needed to be an end use of the station. And we're very grateful to Amber Valley, and particularly Adrian Anderson, the case officer at the time. He came to meetings, he enabled us to understand the process, which obviously is quite complicated. And at times, from the community's point of view, they felt nothing was happening. And once we were involved and we had the understanding of what was going on, we used a phrase quite often, it's in due process. So the CPO order came through, and just a little of the involvement of the history group since the listing of the station, or the relisting of the station. 2019, we had an exhibition, and the slide on the left shows our then and now exhibition, and the particular focus that we had at that time on the station. The outcome of the compulsory purchase order wasn't known at that point, but we were able to bring alive history of the North Midland Railway, some stories about users of the station, and obviously photographs, which were very important and informed going forward some of the consultation and lottery bids information. So we were able to contribute to that. Also local knowledge, we could contribute oral history. We knew a gentleman who had used the station to store equipment in there and able to take him down and enable the Derbyshire Historic Buildings Trust to understand a little bit more about the building between the station closing and it being renovated. And we've contributed along the way in terms of interpretation and design workshops. On the ground, practically, I'm sure you'll see slides later of some volunteers and community clearing the vegetation. We've begun research into the interpretation boards that will be at the station in the forthcoming months. We've attended public meetings. Our little display boards have been taken around, and it's been an absolute joy to represent not just our history group, but the community who absolutely love and value that station.
Carol, that's absolutely marvellous. I'm going to have to stop you there, but thank you very much indeed. I think everyone can now see how vital the partnership with the community has been, and I suggest probably is very often the case elsewhere in other listed building problems. We're going to move on now to Peter Milner, who is the lead trustee of the Derbyshire Historic Buildings Trust, who is going to talk about how he has led the team and worked with the community to maximise the value of their support. I can't praise Peter Milner enough. He has been absolutely vital to the efficient and now successful implementation of this rescue project. Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Barry. I really should have switched my camera off as you were saying what you've just said, as I've turned bright red with embarrassment. This whole project could not have happened just with one person. It is entirely a team event. It's been an amazing team, embracing so many organisations and so many people. But I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about the significance and the importance of community support in any building at risk project and moving towards saving that building at risk. Community support and community involvement can be far-reaching. We can look at the obvious, which in the case of Wingfield are the communities of South Wingfield and Oakerthorpe. They'd already achieved so much, as you've heard Carol say, towards the saving of this very significant heritage asset. But then, rather like the ripples in a pond, it is necessary to look at the wider communities who may also be either affected or interested in a specific project for that community support and the public benefit. Now, community support and public benefit are usually the key criteria for most of the major potential funders that will be attracted and be prepared to support this type of project. And I think it goes without saying that without public benefit and without community support, the chances of securing the funding necessary could become very, very difficult indeed. The communities around Alfreton and extending out as far as Matlock were also drawn into this project, as we had quickly discovered following a 1,200 household leaflet drop to promote the action the Trust and the local authority were taking. But beyond that, and clearly and obviously identified, was the railway community, which extends not just regionally, but nationally and indeed internationally. The project has been extremely well supported by the various groups and organisations and charities within the railway community, not just simply in direct financial terms, but of equal importance, the advice and information, the little golden nuggets of fact and revelation that they've been able to provide. It all has added to the significance. It is all added to the value of what we're trying to achieve in this particular case. Derbyshire has always been at the centre of the railway industry. Derby Station being the world's first ever tripart station shared by 3 railway companies in 1840. And we are blessed with a significant number of rail heritage organisations, quite literally on our doorstep. The Midland Railway Study Centre has provided a wealth of information for our own researchers. The Midland Railway Trust have been extensively involved and have donated a very, very early Midland Railway waiting room benches for our open day events, as well as time and advice. Peak Rail out at Roseley near Matlock have been the source of original Midland Railway lampposts. And the Friends of the Beneley Viaduct project, again, have been highly supportive, providing little but significant pointers that have helped us along. The Railway Heritage Trust, unable to provide direct funding because it sits outside of their charitable purpose, but have been absolutely invaluable in providing advice to the group, in smoothing away some of the difficulties that a project like this can encounter with Network Rail, and always being available at the end of the phone if we've needed them. The project's special attraction to that community resulted in interest being taken by the programme makers for the wonderful and televised series Architecture Built by Railways, presented by Tim Dunn. And many of you are probably very aware of, may even have watched, the two broadcasts that featured Wingfield Station. So I cannot emphasise enough how significant and how important that particular community in all its forms has been in adding value, adding weight, and adding purpose to the ultimate goal of saving this rarest of rural railway stations. Thank you, Barry.
Thank you very much, Peter. Well, I don't want to waste time by rabbiting on myself. Sadly, our next speaker, Adrian Anderson, who played a vital role as a key officer of Amber Valley Borough Council, is unwell. But fortunately, he was able to send us the notes he'd prepared for his presentation, and I've asked Peter if he would present them on behalf of Adrian. So back to you, Peter, if we may.
Thank you, Barry. As I mentioned to a few people earlier, I only last night discovered that, not being a techie person at all, that the programme Word actually has a wonderful lady person, robotic person, who's able to read out text from a Word document. And I really should have been bright enough to have let her do this for us. However, I'm charged with the task. I am, in this instance, speaking for Adrian, who I have to say has been absolutely amazing in the way that he has undertaken this entire project. Political support. The members of Amber Valley Borough Council have shown support for the restoration of Wingfield Station over an extended period, right back from when the council's cabinet resolved to serve a Section 215 notice under the Town and Country Planning Act 1990, a notice to improve the amenity of the area and make the building watertight. That was in December 2005. And they've also supported the entire project through to completion of the compulsory purchase order and subsequent transfer of the property to the Derbyshire Historic Building Trust on the 10th of December 2019. This support was regardless of which political party may have been in power at any particular time. And their resource. This support was further demonstrated in two key ways, which, along with the upgrading of the listing to Grade 2 star in April 2015, finally enabled the council to take positive action. Provision was made in the 2015-16 council's capital programme toward the costs of acquiring the property via a CPO and for undertaking any necessary repairs required. A provision of £200,000 was included for Wingfield Station and another listed building in similarly poor condition within the borough. In February 2016, resource was formally allocated in the form of a dedicated officer resource, part-time, to provide an enforcement function for legislation on historic buildings. As it turned out, this person ended up being Adrian Anderson. I should probably mention at this point that when I, Adrian Anderson, joined Amber Valley Borough Council in May 2016, he had no experience whatsoever in either conservation or planning. I'll pause there and smile because I have to say that my involvement in this project as being without any conservation background or training whatsoever. So in many ways, Adrian and I actually were virgins in this territory. Perhaps that's probably not a phrase I should have used. Anyway, Adrian came primarily from a housing background, and more specifically, working with empty and vacant properties, and importantly, had experience of enforcing legal action on empty property owners, including compulsory purchase. In what was very much a case of learning on the job, Adrian and his colleague Marie Windsor, IHBC's in-house legal exec, undertook a crash course on listed building enforcement with the invaluable support throughout from Amanda White at Historic England. Prior to Adrian's employment at Amber Valley, some important work had been undertaken by Rachel Coates, a planning policy officer, who had engaged with the owner and carried out several visits to the site to try to assess what their plans were for the building, if any. Vitally, Rachel had also successfully applied to Historic England for grant assistance for the preparation and service of a repairs notice. The repairs notice, under Section 48 of the Planning, Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas Act of 1990, was the first step in the process to acquire the building. But prior to service of the notice, the council had to undertake two time-important processes: identify an end user to take the building on following compulsory purchase, and procure an appropriate professional survey for the building and draw up the schedule of repairs required for the repairs notice. Work was subsequently undertaken to prepare a tender for professional services, and an information pack was put together, and expressions of interest were requested from suitable interested parties. This ultimately resulted in Bench Architects of Buxton being awarded the professional services contract, and the Derbyshire Historic Buildings Trust installed as the council's preferred back-to-back partner should the council proceed to compulsory purchase. In this period, May 2016 to February 17, the council had procured an external legal resource to assist the in-house team and carried out informal discussions with the owner surrounding a voluntary disposal of the property, but to no avail. Thank you, Barry.
Peter, thank you so much. That's very helpful. And our next speaker is Amanda, who you've referred to, or who Adrian referred to, from Historic England. And I think it's already apparent how very important Historic England's involvement has been. Over to you, Amanda.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for that introduction, Barry. I have a slightly unstable connection this morning, so I am going to turn my camera off because that does seem to make a difference. And I'm really sorry. I just have the one slide, and it's terribly dull, but it does include key information, and that's presented now. But anyway, on we go. So much has already been said about our part in the rescue of Wingfield Station, so I'll keep this relatively short. The deterioration condition of the station site had been a concern to Amber Valley Borough Council, local groups and local people for many years, as you have already heard. They had long recognised the significance of the site and championed its cause. Action had previously been taken, and there had also been informal discussions between Historic England and Amber Valley's Conservation Officer, Rachel Coates, as you've had mention of, in the years 2015. 2015, as you've already heard, was a seminal year. Wingfield Station was afforded Grade 2 status as part of a wider review of heritage assets that would potentially be affected by Midlands mainline electrification. The site immediately became eligible for inclusion on Historic England's Heritage at Risk Register. It was included in the same year in recognition of its very bad condition and at Priority A. imminent risk of further rapid deterioration or loss of fabric with no agreed solution. By 2015, the condition of Wingfield Station was becoming critical. Having considered the possibility of working with the long-time private owner, Mr. G, our strategy was to support and assist the council in exercising its statutory powers, to this end to pursue a repairs notice and compulsory or voluntary purchase. At the same time, we sought to encourage the Derbyshire Historic Buildings Trust to work up a project and secure finance in order to enter into a back-to-back agreement and take the site on. We are acutely aware of the limited resources, people and money within very many local authorities. So our support was not limited to funding. It was additionally about building confidence and being available in a timely manner to provide advice and to act as a sounding board. So we provided technical, legal and financial support. Various grants, as tabled, were awarded, beginning with a grant to work up and serve a repairs notice in early 2016. The grant covered a range of goods and services and included provision for the appointment of a lead advisor, that was an accredited architect, quantity surveyor, ecologist for scoping surveys, legal advisor and valuer. I would say that we didn't enter into supporting the council with a repairs notice lightly, given the potential for CPO, but we were happy to do so in the circumstances here, as there was a well-considered and tested opportunity for a back-to-back agreement with a trusted third party, namely the Derbyshire Historic Buildings Trust. What I would say, in the absence of that, we'd otherwise have encouraged an urgent works notice. So all went smoothly, and you've heard quite a lot already, and the Secretary of State confirmed the compulsory purchase order in summer 2019. Amber Valley acquired the station site later in that year, and on the 9th of December, it was passed to the Derbyshire Historic Buildings Trust pretty soon thereafter. By this time, the Trust had already secured a Stage 1 National Lottery Heritage Fund award to develop their project to conversion to business use. We and the Trust had already begun exploring options to fund the most immediate of repairs, wholesale re-roofing and the repair of trackside elevations. This included the associated and very costly series of line closures. A two-stage grant was awarded to the Trust in May 2020, and an increase followed in January 2022. The first grant was awarded at 80%, and the second grant was awarded at an exceptional rate of 100%. This in the then context of post-COVID materials shortages, spiralling inflation, there had been multiple price increases in quick succession, and fixed, very difficult to move, line closures. We were also mindful of the Trust's need to contribute to the comprehensive second phase of work to be supported by the lottery. Our grant-aided work completed in summer 2022. Much was at that time still to be done, and we continued to be involved from a heritage at risk perspective and as a statutory consultee in the planning process for the subsequent work, the work that is all but finished. The building will officially be opened later this month, as I'm sure we'll hear from others later, and we'll of course be pleased to remove Wingfield Station from the HAR register. Thank you.
That was brilliant, Amanda, and I think everyone listening will understand and appreciate that it could not have, this project could not have been done without the terrific support of Historic England and its officers. That has to be said.
Well, that's very kind, Barry, but if I could just interrupt politely. And I think Alan said it earlier, this was a fantastic team effort, and I think it was everybody coming together collegiately, working together, and actually if one of those cogs had not been working as it did, then you know, it was about the right time, the right people are moving forward together. So that's very kind, but I think actually it was everybody. But thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. We go back to Peter now, looking at the further preparations that the Derbyshire Historic Building Trust made in furthering its project. Peter. Peter, over to you.
Thank you. The review of options in a project such as this is an early and vital stage when considering how and at what point intervention with a reluctant owner could or should be entertained. It is important that the undertaking of the review is approached in the most open-minded way possible, because ultimately the options appraisal may well be tested at an inquiry. By open-minded, I mean that every reasonable possible option for reuse must be considered, even if it's then discounted, with a clear evidential trail of the considerations that have been applied. There are three key elements in undertaking an options appraisal: feasibility, viability, and the test for optimum viable use. Feasibility looks at the practical elements that either enable or constrain a potential option. The practical elements obviously vary from project to project, but in essence, usually comprise physical restraints such as plan form, site density, or scale, the form of construction relating to an existing building, services that are or may be available. And then we have external constraints. Locality could be a significant constraint, planning, which includes conservation and statutory legislation, covenants that may restrict or prevent options being considered, and other regulations, of which there are many. And as an example of how regulations might impact on a project is well illustrated with Wingfield Station, which backs directly onto a fully operational mainline railway, thus requiring the approval and consent of Network Rail for all and any work undertaken within 6 meters of the common boundary. And in this particular case, restrictive covenants that had been imposed by the British Rail Property Board when they first sold the property as well. Viability. Economic factors can have a very significant bearing when establishing the optimum viable use. These factors can be national or even international and or macro. The economic factor of impacting on, for example, a rundown shopping centre with high vacancy ratio may have very different considerations to the national economy, which could be booming at that time. Economic embraces social factors, and these also have to be taken into account, as social factors can play a significant part in establishing that optimum viable use. Capital. It is important to establish in the early part of this the quantum of capital that may be required to fulfill each option that is being considered, as this then leads into the question of funding and the likely sources that could be available for the project. And the market. Detailed analysis undertaken to establish the level of market need for any particular option being considered, not just for the use itself, but also for the methodology of marketing. For example, there may well be a proven demand for office space in the locality, but only for rented space and not for owner occupation. And in macro, not for the taking on of liabilities for the long-term maintenance of a heritage asset, a factor that could either have a positive or negative impact on the final assessment. And back to Wingfield Station again. And in this instance, the Trust seeks to hold properties we are directly restoring for both the dual purpose of securing an income stream and ensuring a secure future for the asset. Now, this factor may seem rather trite, but when we consider funding, that factor can have a significant and influencing impact when approaching major external funders. And then finally to the SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. These are sometimes called situational assessment or situational analysis. The SWOT draws together and tests many of the conclusions drawn down from the previous elements. The first three are pretty obvious and self-explanatory, but it is the fourth that introduces a new element, a sub-element, timing. Even the most straightforward of development projects can pass through more than a single market cycle. It was in 2014-15 when I first undertook a simplified desktop appraisal for Wingfield Station. My full and detailed option appraisal or viability or project viability assessment was concluded in 2017. That is 6 years ago. And it was then a very different world, both economically and politically. Markets change, and in arriving at the range of potentially economically viable uses is the need for flexibility of both design and intention. And so, to the optimum viable use. This is very clearly defined. If there is a range of alternative, economically viable uses, the optimum viable use is the one likely to cause the least harm to the significance of the asset, not just through the necessary initial changes, but also as a result of subsequent wear and tear and likely future changes. Back to Wingfield. Many have asked why it was not converted to a private dwelling. And indeed, despite what I would refer to as disabilities, such as the proximity of the Midland Main Line and its Grade 2 listed status, there would have undoubtedly been a potential market as a private dwelling. But the degree of harm resulting from modern intervention, both internally and externally, was far greater than the option that we finally adopted. The decision-making is an almost symbiotic process, drawing all the threads of analysis together to find the best fit. And there can be several. Minimizing risk. This takes many forms, from the simple commercial project to the infinitely more complicated heritage project, where managing risk applies not only to the developer, perhaps a building preservation trust, but also to satisfy and secure the confidence of funders. Those considering any application for funding for a project will inevitably look at the wider picture, embracing the developer themselves, their strengths and their weaknesses, other funders and risks that may be associated with their preconditions, such as a first charge or a preemptive right, the risk of the project falling foul of legislation and regulation, the market, demand, all the factors already considered and more. So for the Building Preservation Trust, a primary objective must be first identifying those risks before the funders do and applying ameliorating solutions early into the project. For the local authority, they have to be fully satisfied that the risk has been minimalised if they are to take compulsory purchase proceedings. They will require preemptive agreements, and preemption agreement and a performance agreement if they're going to hand over the responsibility for the restoration to a third party. And the need to establish significance. In terms of heritage-related planning policy, significance is defined as the value of a heritage asset to this and future generations because of its heritage interest. Significance derives not only from a heritage asset's physical presence, but also from its setting. The MPPF definition further states that in the planning context, heritage interest may be archaeological, architectural, artistic, or historic. I mentioned earlier the possibility of converting Wingfield Station for residential use. And in doing so, we had to consider the level of intervention that such a use would introduce, not only to the building, but also to the setting. Establishing the significance of the station house itself within its setting and within the context of the nearby station master's house and cottage was key in confirming the degree of resulting harm should such a use, confirming the degree of resulting harm such a use would create. An important and necessary exploratory consideration is one of enabling development. Enabling development is a planning mechanism which permits departure from planning policies in appropriate cases, and so enables conservation of a relevant heritage asset in cases where otherwise the future of the asset would not be secured. It is not in the public interest to pursue enabling development if there are alternative means of delivering the same outcome for the heritage asset, such as other sources of public or private investment. It is an inherently inefficient way of realizing money for the conservation of heritage assets, because it is likely that only a small percentage of the value of the new development is put towards the repair and maintenance, the other percentage going on the cost of the enabling development. There are occasions when it is important to consider the opportunity for enabling development. Indeed, at Wingfield, we were dealing with a site totaling approximately 1 acre. It would only have taken perhaps 2 or 3 building plots to make a high-level contribution towards the capital cost of saving and restoring the station house. The analysis of the significance of the building and its setting, reinforced by the inclusion of the site within a conservation area, confirmed that enabling work in the form of allowing new development within the curtilage of the site would be very strongly opposed by planning, and rightly so. My point, though, is that enabling work was an option we had to consider, and any project should also take that into account. Ameliorating costs. Early on, the Wingfield appraisal identified the cost burden of both repairing and restoring a building that not only backed directly onto the Network Rail boundary, but had a half-metre eaves overhang. We were going to have to work off Network Rail land, and for this we would need to erect scaffold and allow tradesmen to work whilst 100-mile-an-hour express trains raced past, not 4 metres away. One way to remove this burden would be to pick up the station building and set it back 6 metres. We looked carefully at the practicalities and estimated cost, followed by exploratory talks with Historic England, who, rightly so, indicated that such is the significance of the setting and the station's relationship with the adjoining buildings, that such an option would be resisted. But we did consider it. In order to satisfy the criteria required to justify a successfully confirmed CPO, such was the level of detail and considerations required in identifying the optimum viable use, to enable Amber Valley to then proceed with confidence and commence their action. Acceptance of roles. A project to save a building at risk involves at differing stages a wide range of professional skills, and early doors the project team, which at that stage may consist of only a very small number, need to first identify and then start to bring together those most able to contribute to the initial appraisal stages. With buildings, this inevitably involves an architect, quantity surveyor, engineer, grant advisor, planning consultant, and I have to say, so often overlooked, a development surveyor. For the local authority, considering the wisdom of pursuing the ultimate action, a building preservation trust or other potential partner having strong, knowledgeable, and a professional team engenders confidence and encourages the authority towards the process of preparing the all-important CPO. The external partner to the authority should be drawn into the process and be prepared to work with the team assembled, and which inevitably includes planners, the legal eagles, the in-house estates department, plus outside bodies, Historic England, and the authority's own external professionals engaged to provide independent advice, including verifying the partner's option appraisal and necessary tests should the matter proceed and placed in front of an inspector. Each and every member of that team needs to be able to make a positive contribution towards the process. Thank you, Barry.
Thank you very much, Peter. We're going to have a 5-minute comfort break now. We've slipped just a tiny amount. So I'm actually going to eat into that comfort break by a couple of minutes. Can we all get back for 10:50 when we will hear more about the process for the service of notices? Thank you very much.
Barry, sorry to be a party pooper on that, but I'm going to need just a few more minutes than 5 as I'm on next again.
Okay, well.
Forgive me.
Okay.
You're free to keep an illness, answer the phone. Please leave a message after the phone and I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Thank you.
When you finish recording, please hang up or press the hash key for more options.
Peter, you've got 15 minutes, not 5. Peter, you have 15 minutes for Andrew Anderson's next contribution.
I think I can make time up for you on this one.
Thank you very much. Okay, we'll restart. Again, Peter is stepping in for Andrew's absence. I might just say that Amber Valley Borough Council is a relatively small local authority, and as are many or all local authorities, very hard pressed. So their involvement was impressive. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you. The process for serving of notices is comprehensively detailed within the Historic England publication, Stopping the Rot, a guide to enforcement action to save historic buildings, and also within the government's guidance on compulsory purchase process and the Critchell Down rules. So I won't go into too much detail here, but just suffice to say that the process takes time. This is exacerbated by officers also having to obtain council approval for each notice and intending course of action, which inevitably means a report to an appropriate meeting with the authority to make the relevant decisions. As expected, in this case, the owner made no attempt to carry out any of the work specified in the repairs notice within the 2 months time frame from service, and this led to the council resolving to proceed to compulsory purchase. I want to highlight a few of the considerations that we had to work through as part of the CPO process. The council made a successful application to Historic England for an acquisition grant to underwrite the compulsory purchase. As part of the identification of a preferred back-to-back partner, DHBT carried out a feasibility study to identify a sustainable future use for the building. This fed into the CPO, as the council could only CPO relevant land. The owner had in his possession a separate parcel of land on the same site. This was essentially a piece of scrub woodland with little value. The council had no interest in purchasing this piece of land, but to facilitate future access to the site, had to include within the relevant land provision a sliver of this owner's additional land adjacent to the roadside boundary in order to improve the line of sight at the entrance to the site. The council had to notify any relevant interested parties, which notably in this case included Network Rail, as they had a trackside access adjacent to the site. Identification of the relevant contact was the difficult part, but once this was done, their sign-off on the CPO was quite straightforward. Ongoing negotiation and discussion with the owner, the council had to demonstrate that they had been reasonable and had continued to engage with the owner to try and facilitate an informal resolution. Officers met with the owner a dozen times during this period, which included making an offer to purchase. Thank you, Barry.
Thank you very much, Peter. That's very helpful. We're now moving on, actually a few minutes early, to Bill Bevan. The Derbyshire Historic Buildings Trust retained the services of Bill as a consultant to undergo public engagement and to promote publicity. Bill is a experienced person in the field of heritage interpretation, and he has only recently stepped down as chair of the Association for Heritage Interpretation. Over to you, Bill.
Thank you, Barry. And I should mention I'm only half of the project engagement coordinator team. My colleague Rachel Costigan has volunteered me to do this role today. So as we have heard, community involvement and public engagement have been essential to the saving of Wingfield Station, and they have continued to be at the heart of the lottery project. It is really essential, as I'm sure we all know, that any historic building restoration should be done for public benefit, so that the building's importance and relevance to society, along with an understanding of the heritage building skills required to look after buildings, are shared and appreciated widely. Public involvement tends not to add an enormous amount to project costs when you have a large and expensive restoration project, yet reaps great benefits when well planned. The process for public involvement in the lottery funded project began right at the beginning when the trust developed their bid. People were consulted to find out why Wingfield was important to them and how they would like to be involved. DBA consultants spoke to neighbours, community groups, schools, colleges, visitors, local rail passengers, and railway and history enthusiasts. They did this through a series of public meetings, surveys, and one-to-one meetings as well. As a result of this work, a costed programme of public engagement and involvement was put together. And that work made sure that this engagement side was relevant to the needs and interests of these groups. A consultative bottom-up approach rather than a top-down one. As a result of this, people have contributed their time and skills to help. They have attended public events to see the work, and schools and colleges have been involved in on-site educational opportunities. Also, interpretation tells a station story. So before I get on to some examples of what we've done, I'd just like to mention evaluation. It is essential that the impact that public engagement has is recorded and evaluated. This helps you identify the diversity of people who engage with the project, including audiences new to heritage, as well as your existing audiences, and what people enjoyed, learned, or gained from being involved or visiting. The photo that you see on the screen, and that has been up since I started speaking, is of the first public meeting after lottery funding was secured. This was held at South Wingfield Social Club. At this meeting, we shared information about the project with the local community and invited people to get involved with a number of opportunities. 50 people attended and about 25 people volunteered to do a range of tasks, including historical research, oral history, ground maintenance, leading guided tours, and helping with events. And for these volunteers, we have provided training, guidance, and mentoring throughout. One thing I was particularly involved in was in looking after or managing or coordinating a research group. This group of people, some who are members of the local history groups, some who are new to research, interrogated online and physical archives, and recorded oral history interviews. As a result of that, they discovered much new information and personal stories that help make the building relevant to people today. Many of the members of this group went on to write content for the interpretation panels on site and for the Trust's website. Right, I'm just going to show you 3 or 4 examples of some of the things we have done. Next slide, please, Lucy. In September 2022, we opened the station for the Heritage Open Days. The day attracted 75 visitors, and this is a family selling railway tickets. Next slide, please. This is a tour provided to students of Nottingham-Trent University. They have been one of a number of further and higher education colleges involved throughout the project. People learning building skills from Chesterfield College have taken part in the restoration, and students at Broomfield College created a Wingfield Station themes exhibit for Gardeners World Live at the NEC, visited by thousands. Next slide, please, Lucy. Oh, there we go. We have held a number of hard hat and meet the craftspeople tours during the restoration work. Here, a group of visitors are introduced to the techniques of wet cornicing by the person doing the job. And nearly 300 visitors have had a tour of the station during building work and just prior to building work in the last 12 months. Next slide, please, Lucy. The public engagement and the public events will culminate in a programme of launch events at the end of this month. As well as a private launch, we will have a public Victorian Day, a reading of Charles Dickens' The Signalman by lantern light at night, guided tours, a family trail featuring a mouse named after a Victorian Wingfield plate layer, and activity sessions with the likes of Derbyshire Wildlife Trust. The guided tour has been developed and will be led by volunteers who have been trained over the last 3 months and will be able to continue to lead those tours into the future once the tenant and the ongoing future of the station is confirmed. We already have almost 300 people booked into a public launch event, and we expect many more to drop in on the days. Thank you. Back to you, Barry.
Thank you very much, Bill. That's very helpful. We're moving on now back to Peter to talk about the next stage of how the Derbyshire Historic Building Trust implemented its rescue. Peter.
Thank you, Barry. When we began the project, following handover of the station, we had already secured from the Heritage Lottery Fund the offer of a grant conditional upon the CPO succeeding for the development phase. We were geared up to look at the project in a single delivery phase when Historic England, deeply concerned, as indeed we were, that the length of time it would take before we were actually able to commence any work on this building would lead to the building facing potentially, certainly one further winter and possibly a second. And as you've seen in the many images, the state of the structure was pretty grim. Water has been pouring through that roof now for the best part of 40 years. And there was dry rot in the building. And it really was a very, very poor structure. So Historic England stepped in and offered an urgent works grant. Now, ordinarily, and indeed we had made a provision for urgent works in our original application, ordinarily the urgent works would be the minimum that it would take to secure the building from weather and from those seeking to gain access. And in most cases, that would probably have involved temporary roof covering, boarding up all the windows, making it secure, and at least leaving it such that the weather was no longer able to enter the structure. However, and we keep emphasizing this point, this building backs onto a mainline operational railway, Network Rail, whose consent would be required for anything that we did to this building, refused to approve any temporary measures to secure the roof. They would only approve a permanent solution. Such was their concern that any temporary measure could well end up on the railway tracks. And for that reason, Historic England effectively extended their normal criteria to include a permanent repair, a permanent solution for the building from the eaves up and to the trackside elevations. The first element would be scaffolding. And as already mentioned, the scaffolding, something like about 60 meters in total in length and 3 stories high, would have to be erected on Network Rail land. In order to do so, that could only take place when there were no trains running. We would need a possession order. And Network Rail were prepared to give us a possession order, but only between the hours of 11 p.m. on a Saturday night and 7 a.m. on a Sunday morning. Just 8 hours. Impossible to erect that amount of scaffolding in such a short space of time, which had to incidentally be fully encapsulated. We needed a minimum of 3 possession orders spread over 3 weekends and managed to complete the erection of the scaffold just in time. It was a close run thing. And we would need a further 2 possessions ultimately to take it down. The other issue that we faced, again, Network Rail would have been very concerned, and indeed may have prevented us from bringing a crane on site to remove the damaged and defective chimney pots and stacks. And therefore, the appointed contractor made the decision to extend the scaffold upwards so that he could use an old-fashioned chain and hoist to raise the stone chimney pots from their base and lower them to the ground. The urgent works phase was tendered in July 2021, and commencement began in October of that year. Sadly, just as we went out to tender, the beginning of that incredibly difficult and silly period of construction cost inflation was creeping in. And by the time we'd received back the tenders, completed tender analysis, tenderer interviews, and decided on the preferred tenderer, costs were already beginning to escalate. Historic England recognised that and stayed with the project and stayed with us through what proved to be an extremely difficult and trying period of trying to deal with construction inflation. The phase, I said, was basically from the soffit up. But there was specialised work involved in that, not just to the joinery. But it was discovered that the completely missing soffits and many of the missing soffit supports actually were originally formed out of lime plaster. And to simply provide lime plaster soffits to just the trackside elevation would have been foolish and difficult. And so Historic England agreed that we could continue that work around the entire building. And so everything from soffit up was renewed, repaired, restored, and put back. And completion of that phase took place in June of 2022. Our contractor for that phase was IHBC of Melbourne in Derbyshire, and the standard and quality of their stonework, their slating, the slates incidentally, which were originally from the Penrhyn Quarry in North Wales. The replacement slates came back from the Penrhyn Quarry from North Wales, as did the lead-rolled eaves to the hips. It was fully restored to a very, very high standard indeed. We then, having split the contract, the works contract, the delivery phase into two phases, we then went out to tender the balance of the works, the restoration internally, the completion of the external restoration, and the site works themselves, which included installing a brand new connection to the main sewer in Home Lane, a distance of something approaching 200 metres away. Ackroyd's of Nottingham, again, specialist conservation contractors, were the successful tenderer for that phase. And work commenced in February 23. However, I need to take a slight step back because I made earlier mention of the need to minimize risk. We obviously needed to apply then for our round 2 application for the funding for this further delivery phase. And the National Lottery Fund recognised that because of the wonderful intervention of Historic England in funding the urgent works phase, we had collectively de-risked this project to the extent that the lottery, if I may use the phrase, nodded through our application and provided the funding that we required to finally deliver the project, which incidentally completes on the 23rd of this month. Thank you, Barry.
Thank you very much, Peter. I can't resist telling people that you actually did try to argue with the Penrhyn Quarry in South Wales that we might get a reduction as a returning customer. Didn't actually work, did it?
No, it didn't, sadly. Fell on deaf ears, did that argument.
We're doing very well. I hope you're ready, Ben. We're going back to Ben Robinson for his view of the lessons learnt from his perspective as an officer of Historic England. Over to you, Ben.
Thanks very much, Matt. The other slide that I have one slide. That's it. I tried initially to think about a project like this in classical terms and erecting pillars to support some kind of portico or pediment. But actually, I've gone back to the vernacular to illustrate it. And I think from our perspective, the first thing is, as conservation professionals, as people who are passionate about the historic environment, passionate about old buildings, we sometimes take for granted that our vision is not necessarily shared by everyone. Where we see a pile of timber we can visualize a building coming together. Where we see a wreck and a disaster, we know in our experience that that can be made right, that we can create a functioning building that will be viable in the future and worthwhile in the future. Other people just can't see that. So it's so important to have that vision spelt out at the outset. What are we trying to achieve? We can't take for granted that everyone is immediately going to see what we see and buy into it. So to visualize that, to express what we want to do, that sort of getting the public on board, the politicians on board, everyone to buy into this vision of what we're trying to achieve. And it's worth spending significant time on that. Similarly, people may then buy into the vision, but unless you've got a solid plan, all the things that Peter was talking about, you've done the studies, the options, the viability, this will wash its face, and you can prove that. Unless, again, you can express that plan or plans in solid terms, because a notable feature of our intervention here was that we had a plan A, but we also had a plan B and C, as did the trust, in terms of where the finance would come from and how this project might be visualized. So again, you need to be able to express that and help people to make the leap towards from the vision to something that can actually be delivered. And obviously having a track record, having examples that you can draw on is helpful in that respect as well, but a bespoke plan for what you're trying to achieve. And then the sort of three parts really that I think are the three themes that are most significant are the funding elements, and I've expressed this in terms of the separate frames of the Croc building that we're trying to build here. The funds, obviously vitally important. Most grant givers are not going to make a vague promise about delivering funds at the right time. Most grant givers require an application. They require a time scale and milestones to be achieved by. And for example, for us, we have a year budget spend term. So we get our budget at the start of the year and we're supposed to spend it by the end of the financial year. Now, as we've seen, these sorts of interventions don't necessarily work smoothly and to timescales. So that funding has to be flexible. It has to respond to unfolding situations, the increase of costs, COVID, etc., the railway requirements in this case. And as funders, we really, really have to recognise that it's all very well expecting someone to apply for a sum of money and for that project to be delivered in the year to that budget. That's actually not that realistic. It doesn't happen in many cases these days. So we need the flexibility and flexibility in our timing of that offer as well. We don't make upfront promises on draft applications. However, that's really what's needed to get a project going, confidence that money will be there when it's required. So we need to find a way of getting these sums of money into our budget lines and firm commitments without actually making the formal offer. And that's something that we sort of struggle with, but managed to do on this occasion. Then people have alluded to the political support and community support underlying that, because the politicians in the main will do what their public want them to do. They will want to be seen to be doing the right thing. So that community support, absolutely vital, but that has to translate into a political commitment, and that has to be a cabinet or a council resolution, a formal resolution that we're going to see this thing through. Now, realistically, it's very unlikely that a council would decide to make that commitment absolutely right at the outset, but you can do it in a step-by-step basis, much like the funding. You can fund one stage and then we'll pause and see how it goes and then fund another. It's the same with political support. We'll have a resolution that we want to do something about it formally, and then as we get nearer the time, we'll have a resolution that we're going to serve a notice if the owner doesn't respond to it, and then we're going to have a resolution that we will serve the notice on a certain day. So it's a step-by-step process. But importantly, it gives funders and others the absolute certainty that a decision has been made by an authority and will be followed through. Vague comments in the press, you know, a councillor saying something is virtually meaningless. There has to be a written statement that this will be followed through. And then we've heard a lot about the partners. Obviously, the key partner, the back-to-back recipient, whoever that may be, a trust, BPT, the council itself, another owner, and those options were explored in this case. A commercial owner was explored as well. And very important to keep the community support going in that as well, and the partners working together, communicating and sharing information, and kind of pulling together, and thinking also about what other partners might be drawn in as part of the process. But the really key thing is you can't necessarily expect all this to happen all in one go. The funding arrives on one day, you know, you've got your political support, you've got your partners, and everything just sort of, life doesn't happen like that. So what you do, much like a CRUC frame, is you assemble the frameworks, the frame in advance. Aspects of it will be built quicker than others. You've done your preparatory work, you've got some of your funding, more is on the way. You've got your political support, it goes so far, more is on the way. You've got your partner, key partner, other partners are coming in and more on their way. And you've got to keep all the momentum going and the confidence going, so that at the crucial point, all of those frames can be hoisted up and the whole thing stacks up as a structure. You've got to have everything in place, so when push comes to shove and that critical moment, the serving of the notice, everything can be all pulled together and create that solid framework. If you have one element but not the others, even two elements, you can only get so far. There comes a point at which all your preparatory work, your building work, has to coincide. And that's the trick, keeping it all in step, keeping the confidence among all the different elements, the funders, the partners, going at the same time, being seen to maintain momentum, even if there's big bumps in the road, in order that you can get to that point that it all lifts together. And in this case, that worked extremely well, for mainly due to the huge dedication of the trust, of the council, of the various other partners. This has been a really exemplary experience, I would say.
Can I jump in there and offer the just the view of the National Lottery Heritage Fund, who
just hang on, Leslie, because I'd like to introduce you. I just want to thank Ben very much for that very helpful and imaginative view of the process. Thank you. Now, next will be speaking Leslie Owen-Jones, because the lottery is absolutely critical to this project. And as you've, I think, by now seen, the conservation deficit was very considerable as a result of the building getting progressively more and more derelict. I keep saying we couldn't have done this with someone or another body and so on, but we could not have done this without the fantastic support of the National Lottery Heritage Fund. Over to you, Leslie.
Thank you, Barry. I mean, just to summarise, really, this was a heritage enterprise scheme, and we pay for those schemes on a conservation deficit basis, with the public engagement activities happening during the construction phase, because the building won't necessarily be open to the public once completed and occupied by its new tenant. So that was the basis of the scheme. I suppose we've had so much good stuff this morning. Bill Bevan has covered the public engagement side really well. Ben's obviously just done an excellent presentation about bringing it all together. I think from our point of view as a funder, what we're looking for is skill and will amongst the people gathered around the table. And actually, if you look around the table, you know, we've got the will, we've got all of the skills that you could possibly need amongst the partners, Historic England, the county council, the district council, and the trust. and the local history group. We've got everything that we needed there. And Peter talked about de-risking the project. All of those elements coming together in that coordinated fashion have helped to de-risk what on the face of it is a very, very risky, complex and difficult project, which also had the added disbenefits of COVID and cost inflation thrown into the mix. From our point of view, when we make an investment into a community, we want to stick with it. We want that investment to continue in that community, even if we have these difficulties along the way. So I suppose my encouragement to everybody watching this is to come and talk to us if you've got projects that you want to talk to us about. And just bear in mind that we can and will be flexible. We look at, when issues arise on projects, we look at how those risks are being managed and whether it was something that could have been foreseen. So we are prepared to be flexible. We have been on this project. We've extended the timetables, we've looked at grant increases, we've given grant increases, and we've done variations to the grant contract where we could take into account extra funding that was coming from Historic England. So I would encourage people to look at some of those difficult buildings that we've all got on our list and think about whether you can do something that builds on what you've learnt this morning by bringing those partners together and coming to and talking to us as funders. We see this as a real success story. We're really proud to have been part of it.
Leslie, that's smashing, and thank you very much for that contribution. Jeremy Fenn is going to be our next participant. He now only has to wear one hat. At one stage planning this, we were going to get him to wear the lottery hat as well as the Heritage Trust Network hat, but he is now only having to wear the hat as chair of the Heritage Trust Network. So over to you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Barry. Yes, I was wondering which actual hat to wear, but I'm nothing suitably Victorian. But yes, I've been supporting Leslie and the Trust with the Heritage Funds, also the chair of the Heritage Trust Network, of which DHBT is a member, as are many trusts such as the pictured Ousburn Trust in Newcastle. My brief here is for the network's view, which is quite simple. More of this kind of project, please. Next slide, please. So the Heritage Trust Network is a UK-wide member organisation, an umbrella body for like-minded people who love their heritage and the many benefits it can provide their communities. We were previously the Association of Preservation Trusts, but now have a much broader remit, as you can see, in that not just trusts, but professionals, businesses, individuals and students who get free membership. And we would, of course, encourage everyone watching to look at membership if you're not involved already. So what do? We provide peer networking, training, a great opportunity to learn from people who have delivered projects previously. We know that delivering a project like this is hard, but why not learn from people who have already done 5 already? Many members, like here, like pictured, they're called into action when they see their local heritage and historic buildings deteriorating. Members step in to take action when nobody else will or has been able to, and when the normal property market has failed due to the extent of the conservation deficit, as here. And as Ben says, they have that vision. They know what heritage places mean to people. It's not just an eyesore. It's not just the crumbling building on the corner. That's an important new place for your community. People can make that an exciting venue. They can make that happen. So obviously we work closely with funders such as Heritage Fund, Architectural Heritage Fund, and supported by statutory bodies like Historic England, Cadw in Wales. And the trust actions here at Wingfield, a great example of a member trust in action and working in partnership with funding and funders and local authorities. From the attendance list, I see we have many people watching here who are at local authorities. So what we would say to you is please bear in mind community trusts for helping out as solutions to your buildings at risk. We know it's hard, we know it's really hard, especially taking enforcement action, but just look at what can be achieved when working in partnership. Next slide, please. So yes, more of this type of project, please. A great example of partnership working across many bodies. Brilliant for all of the community engagement that is achieved, because places are for people, and particularly the example of the student work and the garden kind of winning the award is just brilliant. And what we can do now for lessons learned, we can share this project with members across the UK. We're already looking at setting up a group of members and sessions specifically to support trusts and authorities with statutory action like this. So please get in touch if you're interested. And last slide, please. Naturally, you need to plug. So it's our annual conference next week in Newcastle and Gateshead. You're all invited and welcome to come along. A great event for heritage networking and learning from inspirational examples. Tickets remain on sale until 5 o'clock this evening, but let me know if you miss the deadline and I can still get you in. But otherwise, yeah, great work, everyone. So many important lessons learned. Such a great example for supporting enforcement action and great partnership working. And so, yeah, well done, everyone, and more, please. Thanks, Barry.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Well, I'm delighted to say that we are actually slightly ahead of our time schedule. So that's brilliant. You've all been terribly patient having to listen to speaking heads. After the comfort break, it'll be your opportunity to actually take part in a discussion. That's going to be facilitated by Bob Kindred, who I'm sure you'll have now realised who he is and how important a role he's played in the Institute of Historic Building Conservation over the years. I'm going to take the opportunity of just having this extra bit of time to put in one little bit of information which hasn't come out in the presentations, and that is the degree of research that was done into the actual fabric of the building we're saving. We retained the services of Melanie Morris as consultant to look to research the history of the building in greater detail. She in turn brought in another consultant, an expert in historic paint analysis. That was investigated in a forensic way, revealing to us sufficient information to be confident that we can actually reinstate this building pretty much exactly as it looked on opening day, May 1840. And I think there are pretty few restoration projects where that's going to be possible, particularly ones in cases where the building has got to the brink of being economically completely beyond the pale. And of course, this was economically beyond the pale, and only the subsidy provided by Historic England and the National Lottery and others who we will be acknowledging and naming at our opening later this month. Right, we now have an opportunity for a comfort break. We will reassemble at 10:50, if we may, when Bob will lead us on an open forum, and he will initially just sketch out some more outline, some more framework for looking at the whole business of dealing with buildings at risk. So thank you very much, everyone, for being with us so far. I hope you'll stay with us for the open forum when you can have your say. Thank you. welcome back. Over to you, Bob.
Thank you, Barry. Well, given the time we've got left and what we've already covered, I thought what I'd do just initially, I prepared with sort of Barry's agreement, sort of a sequence of short aphorisms, really, to get us started on the basis that it might stimulate some discussion and questions. Although I have picked up 2 questions from the chat, which perhaps we can deal with fairly shortly. But I'm also very happy to communicate with attendees by email or by phone after the event if there are specific issues that arise. And my phone number and email address is on my website. But don't confuse me with the jazz saxophonist of the same name, please. So I've tried to distill these sort of 30 or so points based on nearly 40 years now dealing with buildings at risk, and I'm going to try and cover those in about 90 seconds, which might be a bit of a rush, but I don't want to eat into the time for chat for discussion too much. It's not exhaustive, and it's not in an obviously logical sequence, but it's a sort of tour de horizon to sort of start us off, I suppose. Now, Ben had referred earlier on to the proportion of buildings that are at risk. I think there's a general sense no one knows exactly how many buildings are at risk, but they're probably, based on the total number of listed buildings, probably about 37,000 at risk, which would be 7 to 9% of the overall total. And that number has remained reasonably constant since the 1980s. And it would be remarkable, wouldn't it, if no local authority had at least one building at risk. But frankly, at the present level of statutory action, and we're talking really probably more about repairs notices and urgent works, but we're certainly talking about both, it would take about 780 years to clear the backlog, which is a sobering thought, and clearly more action is needed more rapidly than has been the case in the past. The barriers refer to the fact there's no such thing as a problem building, only a problem owner. And I perhaps just pick up a little later a comment in the chat about, well, what happens if the problem owner happens to be a local authority? But I'll just put that aside for a moment. And of course, the risk grades, I think, are fairly well understood. They were developed at the earliest stages in the early 1980s in trying to assess the degree of risk based on condition and occupancy in broad terms. And so risk grades 1 and 2 are really quite rare, and risk grade 3 comprises most of the bulk of buildings at risk. But I think it's important not to forget, if reviewing at-risk cases, risk grades 4. They tend to be rather overlooked by those authorities that are involved with building at-risk issues. But of course, they're the ones that can go either way. Over a period of time, they may either continue to deteriorate or repairs may bring them back to a reasonable level of condition. So in terms of thinking about buildings at risk, don't just think of the first 3 grades, think of at least into risk grade 4. Now, I think the problem of dealing with these cases is that it represents large-scale, long-term workload. And so it has to be prioritized as part of a balanced overall service by a local authority. And if it isn't done, then it's quite obvious that buildings at risk are going to sort of disappear off the radar, really. And I have to say, as someone who's been monitoring conservation officer jobs for IHBC since 1998, so 25-year database, there is buildings at risk is not a high priority, generally speaking, in local authority job descriptions, and that's, I think, something that probably has to change. It needs to be higher up the pecking order. It doesn't help that there's no National Register of Urgent Works notices, so we don't know what type of works and what levels are being carried out by local authorities. There's no schedule or register of repairs notices, or at least there hasn't been one since the Association of Conservation Officers did their original survey, or rather I did their survey in 1991. But I don't think necessarily that surveys, while they're important, they're not the be-all and end-all. And over the years, I've considered that probably a weather satellite type approach is the most appropriate, which is rapid horizon scanning to identify the worst buildings, and also to seek easy wins. It's much easier to persuade politicians to support more drastic action when, sorry, someone will get that phone in a minute, when it's been shown that buildings can be removed from a register reasonably promptly. It's worth considering volunteers for surveys, but periodic resurvey is essential. And I did a seminar with Historic Lincolnshire, who had used volunteers, and I rather shocked them when I said, so now you've done the survey, when are you going to do the resurvey? And it hadn't occurred to them they would need to go back at some point and check on the buildings they've identified as being at risk. So think about the possible use of volunteers subject to suitable training, but you need to make them conscious of the fact they will need to do it more than once. And obviously this whole question of survey and resurvey is much more straightforward in an urban context than in a rural one, where heritage assets are extremely widely distributed. Now, despite such initial enthusiasm, and also one of the issues involving volunteers is they perhaps expect the local authority to take almost immediate action on the buildings they identify, is that in fact some cases can take 20 to 25 years to resolve, particularly in cases where they can be kept in a holding condition until a final resolution of the buildings is met. I also think that actually there's been a bit of a problem in the way in which the legislation is presented. And why I say that is that in the 1972 Act, the clauses involving urgent works appeared before the ones on repairs notices, and so there seemed to be a fairly logical sequence. You protect the building quickly, and then you consider what you do after that. In the 1990 Act, the process was reversed. The repairs notice provisions appear first, and the urgent works provisions appear after that. Now, surprisingly, local authorities think there is a reason for that sequence in terms of the action they should take, and that is certainly not the case. Those types of works are independent, and you should use them entirely as appropriately. The fact they've got different sequence of clause numbers has got nothing really particularly to do with it. But certainly when using those powers, they all depend on perception more than anything else. Perception by the owner of the council's resolve to take action. I think that's a very important element, irrespective of what the legislation actually says. And of course, the Levelling Up Bill should make the application of urgent works to occupied buildings much more straightforward, and also make cost recovery much more straightforward. That will be done via a simple land charge if the present bill becomes law. Those are clauses 96 to 99 in chapter 3 of the bill, if you actually want to look them up. But clearly, if you're going to take action, it's very helpful if the local authority officers dealing with it have a degree of delegation. Delegated powers extremely helpful in actually getting progress on listed building works underway. Obviously, council resolutions are needed for compulsory purchase, but much of the work can be done if the relevant committees are happy to trust the skills and appropriate expertise of the officers involved with the cases. Now, of course, when you're dealing with repairs notices, and I'm sure some of you have obviously had experiences of this so far, the owner's obviously got three options. They can comply with the schedule of works, do the works that the owner himself thinks necessary, or do nothing. But simply threatening to use the powers, which is usually with a warning letter, will result in over 40% of owners actually starting some works. They may not necessarily be all the ones that are required, but they will actually start. And once a repairs notice is actually served, 80% of the remaining owners actually start some work. So it's as you're cranking up the handle with increasing effect. And it should be also borne in mind, I think it was a point that Peter touched on, that in going for potentially compulsory purchase, you can acquire the land required for preserving the building or its amenities, or for effecting access to it, or for proper control and management. And I think, again, local authorities and trusts don't tend to think widely enough in terms of the land required to actually deliver the project. But owners should be reminded, of course, that demolition in the interim doesn't preclude a CPO from being confirmed. And even at the point at which a compulsory purchase order might go to inquiry, some owners may commence work, which can be very frustrating after getting to that actual point. But the absolute key issue I want to emphasize, actually, I think, is that local authorities only have a 1 in 50 chance of ending up with a CPO'd building. And I think a lot of authorities are afraid to start the process because they think they're going to be left with a building which they then don't have a partner for, they don't actually have a purpose for themselves. So the chance of you actually facing a confirmed compulsory purchase order with a building which you then have to deal with is very, very low. It's also worth remembering, as I conclude really, that there are other powers, including Section 215, untidy sites notices, and a reference was made to that this morning. And there's good practice guidance from 2006 on untidy sites as a way of dealing with some of these issues. And there are powers under the Housing Act as well, which isn't, I think, a necessarily appropriate subject for today. It's worth also just pointing out that local authorities that sometimes had a quite good past reputation for dealing with buildings at risk sometimes no longer do so. And that's a matter of having embedded skills within the authority, that it's something you do. And if the local authority officers then leave, it's something that the local authority should continue to do. And I have a case of a local authority in Lincolnshire where the local Building Preservation Trust complained that the local authority had never dealt with buildings at risk, when in actual fact they had been the second most active local authority in England, and it was because the officers dealing with it had left. So ultimately, it comes down to taking action early, making no procedural errors, and watching out for the owners who always play for time and contest everything you do. So that's my sort of wide tour de horizon. Whether you'd just like me to comment on the also the query read by Tanya Spilsbury about...
Yes, before you do that, can I just suggest to people to participate? Could you either use the reactions button to raise your hand, or put your question or comment into the chat along the bottom of your screen? I think that's the best way we can actually deal with reactions. Okay. So on to Tanya Spilsbury's comment. What happens if the problem owner is a local authority?
It's absolutely nothing quite like that, is there? I mean, quite frankly, from my experience, there isn't an easy solution to this. It requires, I think, the local authority to respond to public and community pressure. I think it's important, if possible, to get the relevant statutory amenity society on side, and you'll perhaps be aware that Victorian Society has an annual 10 most endangered buildings promotion. And also Save Britain's Heritage are particularly effective, I think. They're not a statutory amenity society, but they are very, very effective in bringing pressure to bear and embarrassing local authorities, which I think is possibly what they require. But I noticed that Tanya referred to the issue about the problem of best price for the taxpayer in disposing of buildings. And I'm a bit puzzled by this because there are clear Treasury regulations which state that if you're selling a listed building as a local authority, you can sell it for less than best consideration if you're going to meet social, economic, or environmental benefits. And it used to be the case that building preservation trusts could acquire local authority buildings precisely on that basis. Now, I don't know whether that's because local authorities are unaware of the existence of those rules. I think I have them saved electronically somewhere, buried on a hard drive, if people have never seen them. But I don't believe they've ever been rescinded. And I think it may be that local authorities simply aren't aware that they're able to dispose of buildings on that basis.
Well, that's useful to know. That's useful to know. Can I just comment on Tanya's first question? And I can give an example of how it was done successfully. The Chesterfield Borough Council were concerned with a building at risk in the heart of Chesterfield, right next to the parish church. They approached the owners and got no response, but they had a barrister who was prepared to act pro bono for them. And they wrote to the owners saying, they wrote to the local authority, sorry, I'll start again. They got no response from the local authority, local planning authority, in terms of persuading them to serve a notice. And so they had a barrister who was prepared to give his services pro bono, and wrote to the local authority saying if they did not take their statutory duty of caring for the historic buildings in their area, they would sue them. And the threat of taking the local authority to law was enough to get Chesterfield Borough Council to serve a repairs notice on that owner. So that's one way. If you've got someone prepared to give you legal services. Another example, I'm afraid this reflects badly on Abergavenny Borough Council, but that's way back in the 1980s when housing improvement grants, 100% housing improvement grants were being given for amenities such as new bathrooms, windows, kitchens, and they were being handed out without any kind of control, even where the building was listed. And Long Row, Belper, which is now part of the World Heritage Site, Long Row, Belper, every house in it, every house in that street built by Jedediah Strutt in the 18th century was listed, and each house was getting a house improvement grant was getting very badly damaged in terms of loss of historic character. And so the Derbyshire Historic Buildings Trust, not knowing what happens when a local authority doesn't actually carry out its duty of requiring listed building consent for such alterations, bought one of the houses and carried out an exemplary scheme of work that showed how housing improvement grants could be used in a sympathetic way to bring houses like that up to scratch, published the information sheets, opened the house as a show house for several months after the work was done. And that completely transformed the way the community dealt with buildings in that street. And now the local authority sometimes gets a phone call from an owner saying, Mrs. So-and-so, 5 doors down, hasn't painted her house in the right colour. Actually, there's no control over the colour of the houses, but that just shows the degree to which that disaster scenario was turned around by exemplary action by a building preservation trust?
We've had a comment on the chat that I can't answer, but I'm sure participants this morning might well be able to answer, which from Helen Bauer, about how much the project cost the local authority. And this particular instance, can anybody come back on that aspect?
I certainly can't, but someone may be able to.
Yeah, I'm conscious Adrian and the authority isn't here, unfortunately, but at every step of our negotiations with the local authority, it was quite clear that they would not expose themselves to liability or direct costs. Quite rightly, they wouldn't expose their taxpayers to those things. And therefore, that's why we took a step-by-step approach. Well, we'll go this far, we'll have a look, see how it goes, then we'll go this far, then we'll go this far, and building those frameworks with them, they're part of the framework. And the fact that those costs can be underwritten and that therefore their commitment is limited basically to officer time and a few direct costs makes it much easier for them to participate in this sort of venture. And especially if they know they're not going to be holding the can at the end of the day, if they have a back-to-back recipient that's in place and ready to take over. So the direct cost thing is clearly most authorities don't want to expose themselves to that. And that's understood by everyone right at the outset, unless they themselves are going to take on the project, which increasingly, actually, we're getting inquiries about supporting that as well, because money is coming in for regeneration, for levelling up, and it's quite clear that many authorities can benefit from them and save buildings in their patch that have been a problem for a long time. So I think it's a hopeful scenario, and this isn't exceptional in any means. Wonderful that the trust is there to be the back-to-back recipient, but there are commercial solutions. There's commercial providers as well that can enter into this sort of work. There's a variety of ways to do it, and this authority was not, I wouldn't say, it's a relatively small authority. It's not fantastically well resourced as an authority. It faces what many authorities face. It's not the big rich ones that we should be looking to be doing this, but all authorities that care about their communities and their built environment and can see it working for them in the future.
Thank you.
We've had a question, a couple of questions linked together actually by Jane Giffords on the chat, but I'm not sure I know enough about the buildings to be able to meaningfully comment, because this appears to be a building that has been revealed by other demolitions, but the building subsequently disappeared. But whether it had been listed or turned down for listing, or whether it was in a conservation area, isn't clear. But what I would just make a general observation about, Jane says that luckily a local historian had done a photographic survey. It does raise the wider issue about evidence relating to buildings at risk and how few buildings are recorded. If you go onto the National Heritage List and look for photographs, you'll probably find perhaps 10% of listed buildings have ever been photographed. It does put the onus onto the local authority, or using volunteers, or using local societies or trusts to get, subject to suitable safeguards about public access, photographs of listed buildings, so that in fact it's possible to go back and monitor the state of the buildings and whether they're deteriorating slowly or rapidly or not. So I think there is an issue really related to that. There was also reference to whether in fact part of the solution to this is moving the building to another site, and at one time that was quite popular, with buildings being moved to rural life museums and so on. However, I think that approach is now much less favoured than it was, because of the way in which it reduces the historic context of the building, and that it's far better to try and incorporate it into its existing setting than attempting to move it somewhere else.
Yeah.
All right. I don't know whether any of the other participants would like to come in actually with questions. We haven't got any other clear ones on the chat that might we could respond to, and I don't know whether that satisfactorily answers Jane's question, but it does seem a very specific individual building case, and some of those are a little more difficult to answer when one doesn't know the context of them.
I can't see any more chat questions. I see a
Alan
hand.
wants to come in, though,
Alan.
I think.
Barry and Bob, I was going to have a go at answering Helen Bauer's 4-part question a little more fully, if I could. She asks about the cost to the local planning authority. Clearly, I don't have figures, except to repeat what 2 of us said, that at the outset, Amber Valley set aside a budget of £200,000 to cover the costs of getting this project underway. What it amounted to in the end of the day, I haven't the faintest idea. She was also asking about multiple actions or concurrent actions by a local planning authority. That certainly never happened in Derbyshire. The Trust in its early days may have had 1 or 2 modest concurrent projects, but at the moment, the concept of taking on another Wingfield Station or anything like it is rather daunting, given the complexities of dealing with funding bodies and producing a satisfactory scheme. So it's unlikely that the DHBT, will be doing concurrent projects, but you never know. Our objective is to have a portfolio of projects producing an income that might allow us to be more active in the past. To answer again Helen's point, the Trust was set up way back in '74 and carried out an awful lot of projects in the past when the funding regimes were completely different from what they are now. Historic England and its predecessors had funds to help trusts, as had local authorities, and life was a lot easier. That's partly what caused our trust to become moribund for a period, but thankfully, with new trustees, new vigour, younger trustees by and large, we're moving forward on a more complex projects with the assistance of HE and the lottery. I hope that helps to answer Helen's questions slightly more fully. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Alan. Can I just add that there is provision in the legislation for the Secretary of State, him or herself, to serve compulsory purchase notice. And that very nearly happened in the case of Buxton Crescent, when the Secretary of State was very close to actually serving the notice and had done all the preparatory work so that the owner knew that it wasn't a bluff. And in the end, to avoid a compulsory purchase notice, the owner agreed to a negotiated sale. And so that's quite an important historical action that shouldn't be forgotten. And I think it may be appropriate for a helpful government to take action where the scale of the project is so great that it's unreasonable to think that a local authority should take it on.
Just worth making a couple other comments really about in relation to costs and urgent.
Can I just stop you, Bob, because I think Jeremy wanted something relative to what I just said.
Yes. So following on to the other bits of Helen's question and following on Alan's comment. So on other trusts. So if there is a place where it's not known kind of that there is another trust in place in that county, then speak to the network. It could well be that there is an existing trust, just not very well known. Equally, there are UK trusts with UK-wide remits that can take on projects. I know Ben and Historic England have kind of been able to put them in touch with certain places in order to help make things happen. And then it's possible also to set up place trusts to help out in places and that's being done in places like Sheffield and in Stoke and in Leicester on the call. And that kind of with support from Architectural Heritage Fund, through the Heritage Development Trusts, through the National Lottery with resilient grants, and obviously supported throughout by the network. So there's a great network of brilliant, really old, well-established trusts like Derbyshire. There's other more medium ones. We've got Lincolnshire on the call that do great work, but equally we've got new trusts being developed all the time. And these could be single building trusts, single issue trusts, or trusts that kind of have multiple projects ongoing, such as Great Yarmouth, such as Tyne and Wear. So there's all shapes and sizes. And so if Helen, if there's nothing in your area, then get in touch, and then we might be able to sort something out. Thank you, Jeremy. Sorry, Bob, back to you.
I was just going to make a couple of points about costs, actually, before dealing with a query from Anna Badcock. And the first is that local authorities often say that they can't undertake statutory action because they don't have any budget. To which the answer is that, well, that's complete nonsense, because every local authority has a contingency reserve and is set aside specifically for those kinds of purposes. But as one Secretary of State was invoked, I might actually just invoke another one, which is, bless him, the Secretary of State for Wales, because the Secretary of State for Wales determined that local authorities don't need to ensure that a building is at risk. They need merely to think it's at risk, because in the minds of legislators, the whole issue was on urgency. And so if they thought it was at risk, they could serve a notice, and that was more important than actually proving that it specifically was at risk. But so I think it's a point just worth emphasizing. But there's been a question from Anna, possibly directed to Ben. I'm not sure whether this has already been covered, Ben, about whether Historic England can clarify if underwriting funds is available for all aspects of repairs notices and urgent works, or indeed help with preparing notices, as had been mentioned earlier. So is this partial or more comprehensive?
Yeah, it's all outlined in our guidance to applicants for support with repairs notices and acquisition, and obviously that follows on from stopping the rot, but it's all on the website, the level of support that we can consider providing. Obviously we have to prioritise, and regional prioritisation and national prioritisation is important in that. But I would say, yeah, if you think you need additional support, come and have a discussion with us about it. Nothing's changed on that front. The funding is still there to support these actions. It's not something that's disappeared, and we hope that we'll be able to hang on to it. But we can only hang on to it if people are seen to be asking for it and doing it successfully. So it works both ways. If we don't get the inquiries, and we very often have to go looking for them, to be honest, then we can't show that there's a need.
Ben, can I ask, do you find you've ever, in allocating that budget, either regionally or from or among other regions, is constantly seriously underspent, or is it occasionally overspent, or are you just finding you just don't have sufficient inquiries?
It's really interesting. These are, obviously, as we've mentioned, these are cases that require flexibility, and the easiest thing for any funder is to have a funding stream, a tick box exercise, and just to give out small sums of money to lots of people on low risk projects. These sort of projects don't fall into that category. So there's always quite a lot of, frankly, management you have to do about applications and inquiries like that. But the fact of the matter is that it's not that easy, and my lottery colleagues may agree with this too. It's not that straightforward to give money in the right way to the right people. It's a challenge every year, especially with a in-year annual budget allocation that has to be spent in the right way. It's easy to scatter money around like confetti on things that don't actually need it. To get it in the places where it's needed, where it can be spent, that's the real challenge. So no one should be shy of coming forward and saying, we've got this prominent case, we've tried to crack it, but we really need some assistance. Can you help us?
And I think just to add to that,
you have your hand up. Peter, can you hear me?
I can, but I was going to let Leslie finish speaking first of all.
Sorry, I didn't see your hand up, Leslie.
Oh, sorry. I broke the rules there. Yeah, just to add to that, we do still have money available in our small grants for resilience work and early work, but it really helps us with these more difficult cases if there is that historic England involvement and we can actually join forces and use our money and expertise together to achieve some of these more difficult things. We're not getting those sorts of inquiries through, so I would certainly encourage people to come forward with those inquiries.
Can I ask Jenny, is that part of the new lottery long-term strategy? Because that was certainly intending to be run over, I think, a longer period and specifically to deal with heritage at risk. So I'm assuming that will be particular priority that Trust should think about possibly tapping into.
Saving heritage is one of our new pillars of investment. We have 4 of them, but it's a key one for us, and heritage at risk is a key priority as well. And yes, that funding, as far as I know, is still going to be there for us to deliver in that way.
Peter, did you want to come in on that or something different?
Well, as I made mention earlier, I came in to help out DHBT as someone without any heritage background whatsoever, having spent most of my time helping to demolish buildings and replace them with modern office blocks. So, so from outside, and having listened to all your wonderful experts, there are some very fundamental points that come out of this that really need airing at a political level. Ben's made reference to the fact that it needs political will very often to make anything happen at all. It comes down to a huge lack of funding made available to local authorities to get the correct resources in the correct way to enable the statutory obligations of the authority to be properly fulfilled. I think that's a fairly obvious statement. But where is the incentive? Local authorities need to be incentivized, and at a political level, there must be ways of achieving that. And let me just throw this into the melting pot. The gentleman who owned Wingfield Station was twice taken to court and fined. The authorities on both occasions were able to recover costs, but the fines disappeared into the general government coffers to support the judicial system. And yet, in other avenues, in other areas, local authorities are able to impose fines themselves or unable to keep the fines that are levied on miscreants. So, quite simply, if local authorities are able to retain the fines that result from taking precipitous action against miscreants, would that incentivize them? Would it give them the additional income stream to invest in more conservation officers and a stronger base for implementing the regulations? Something needs to happen, and I think it's going to take a political will to shift it from granting legislation, granting limited resources, to actually making it a robust system.
Thank you.
Barry, do you want to add something to that? I mean, I don't know if I dare even begin down the path about listed building prosecutions, of which I'm the manager of the national database. But only to say that it just occurred to me actually in the last 2 or 3 weeks that it would have been jolly helpful if the current bill passing through Parliament had actually increased the maximum fine levels significantly, and that money was then hypothecated into back into the local authority coffers for conservation staff. But I think overall, local authorities need to have a model of the services they intend to provide, how they intend to divide their time, and whether that is then set by political priorities or officer priorities as to how they actually deal with those. And quite a lot of material relating to that is on the IHBC website, which may help some local authorities in supporting those elements of the work they do that turns out to be non-statutory. And I think that's probably best not to venture too far down that line, or we'd probably be here for several days.
I think public opinion is crucial, and we have done what we can, and we could do more in Derbyshire in trying to give people information through newspapers and television programs about the level of problems for buildings that are much loved. It was very interesting to see in the press the huge response from the public about that wonky pub that got demolished. I mean, obviously it had a particular kind of angle that it was much love for it being wonky, but I mean, it was about a historic building, and people got really very angry about what appeared to be very iffy circumstances of its demolition. And
and chopping down famous trees, it has to be said. So I think there's
chopping down famous trees
tend to coincide to a degree.
Yeah, so perhaps there is a kind of spirit abroad of anxiety about the loss of much loved buildings and parts of our environment that are treasured.
The government is about to consult on 2 potential routes for better protection of non-listed buildings. One is in relation to buildings on local lists, but that is an absolute can of worms in terms of the caliber of the lists and the comprehensiveness of the lists and how well they're reviewed and so on and so on. There are numerous issues related to that. The other one relates to consultation on buildings built before 1948. But you could imagine this is causing a certain amount of anxiety in the 20th century society. So we have yet to see which route that will take. That consultation will actually take place fairly shortly. So there is a general concern about this stemming from local listing, which seems as an initiative to have quietly expired again, there having been 20 pilot schemes, none of which have been the subject of a detailed evaluation or analysis. And the Secretary of State, who was interested in the subject, has been moved elsewhere. So it remains to be seen whether this whole question of additional protection and its concern for buildings that would be of interest, for example, to Building Preservation Trust, will actually gain any additional protection at all.
It's been a long time since we've had a politician who was really very committed to the historic environment, isn't it? I mean, it's just chance, I suppose, of whether someone ends up in a cabinet who really has a natural commitment, like Duncan Sands all those years ago. I thought it was helpful that he was the son-in-law of the Prime Minister.
It also would be helpful, I think, if the whole concept from about 20 years ago of heritage champions within the local authorities was revived. That has been allowed again to quietly expire. And those people, wouldn't necessarily have to be the planning portfolio holder, but someone with a particular interest in the historic environment would then act as the focal point within the local authority to chivvy both their own fellow elected councillor members, but also the chief officers and these relevant professional heritage officers to actually raise heritage as a profile within the local authority where it's absent.
Well, I have to say, in my experience in Derbyshire, it didn't really work. The heritage champions weren't sure what they could do, despite guidance from their officers. I actually chose or recommended a particular councillor to be our heritage champion on the grounds that she had very good stress sense. I couldn't find any other criterion that was appropriate, really.
Well, of course, if they get voted out, you have to start again from scratch. But I think, without wishing, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to criticise Historic England about this. Although I don't think it's strictly their fault, it was a brilliant idea from DCMS. They invested a lot of intellectual input into it, but they then sort of handed it across for Historic England support. And I don't think at that particular time their budget enabled that to be handled well within the regions, and regional convocations of heritage champions, and a couple of them nationally took place, but then they just quietly disappeared because I don't think Historic England resources enabled them to be well enough supported. I might be wrong about that, Ben, but I hope that I'm not doing your organisation down by saying that. I'm looking for further items from the chat, Barry, but don't actually seem to have any that are actually posing specific questions. And I can't see at the bottom of my screen how many participants are still online. So I don't know whether we're still 81 of us, or 21 of us, or 5 of us. But
we've got 51 participants still online.
Right, that's pretty good.
But we have been withering on between us for quite a long time.
We have, I'm afraid. Yeah.
And I think dummies are probably beginning to rumble. So unless anyone's got any burning questions or comments and they want to put their hand up, I think I'm going to suggest we might call it a day. On behalf of the Derbyshire Historic Building Trust, I'm extremely grateful to all our speakers and to the 80+ participants. And I hope it's proved to be a valuable time spent and sharing the experience of what we've done at South Wingfield. And I hope you'll all come and have a look at the end result, which you should be able to see by the end of this month. So
I will just forward on, by the way, because I've had a couple of expressions of interest about these Treasury rules, and I will send those on to the Trust to disseminate. Unless people want to contact me directly, I can send them out from here if they would find those interesting.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, and goodbye.